All right, so today we're going to talk about the biomechanics of life in water, chapter 5, and simply moving around in water. If you've done it, you know that it's more challenging than moving in air. So this transition, this evolutionary transition for aquatic insects back into the water was a really drastic change. Um, Moving or even trying to stay still in water is very different than trying to move or stay still in air. Moving water can crush or sweep organisms away. Moving water can transport materials away from you or to you, can alter the habitat you're in. And the type of water is a really important piece of the habitat. So, are you an organism that lives in still water, on the surface of water, in flowing water? There are challenges with all of these habitats. So the properties of water, things like viscosity, water pressure, and surface tension are very important, and we'll get into that. And for those of you who it's a review for, can skip it. But things like viscosity is a measure of how sticky the water is, and it's represented by mu. The dynamic viscosity of fresh water is about 1.002 times 10 to the negative 3 kilograms per meter per second. And the dynamic viscosity of salt water is just a little bit higher than that. So the addition of salts increases viscosity slightly, but the salinity of seawater, say, is 35 parts per thousand, but the salinity of the Great Salt Lake can be as high as 270 parts per thousand. This is why these two ladies can float around on the Great Salt Lake on a couch. And this is all in comparison to the dynamic viscosity of air, which is about 2 orders of magnitude lower, less viscous, or 50 times less viscous than water. The kinematic viscosity equals the dynamic viscosity divided by the density. And the density of air is very low. So what this means is that the kinematic viscosity of air can actually be greater than water. So all of this is physics, fluid dynamics. You just need to be kind of somewhat familiar with these terms and more try to understand how they influence organisms. So the density of water decreases with warming temperatures. Maximum density for water is actually at 4 degrees Celsius, right above freezing. Because once it freezes, then ice forms. And we know that ice is much less dense because it has a crystalline structure. This is a really cool property of water. If this weren't the case, if ice didn't float, then aquatic organisms would freeze because when it got cold enough, the lakes would freeze solid. And so that just doesn't happen, which keeps a lot of organisms alive all winter long. Water is about 2.5 times as kinematically viscous at 5 degrees C as it is at 35 degrees C. So it's harder to move through cold water, not just because it's cold. I've been swimming in lakes and it's very cold. And I wonder if it just feels harder to swim. It actually is harder to swim because the water is more viscous when it's colder. Organisms that live at depth can also experience intense water pressure. So the deeper you go, the higher the pressure, because basically you're feeling the weight of everything above you, right? So insects that carry air bubbles. That's a typo. Insects that carry air bubbles for breathing are especially influenced by changes in depth and pressure, because Boyle's law states that a tenfold increase in pressure will result in a tenfold decrease in gas volume. So gas is also more soluble at high pressures, so that can influence gas uptake, so like dissolved oxygen uptake. And water pressure can influence buoyancy. So for example, these are fish, right? They're not invertebrates, I apologize, but some fish have swim bladders, and that they can use that to regulate their buoyancy. But they're limited by how deep they can go because the volume of the gas in their bladder decreases and they're no longer able to control their buoyancy, which is why some really deep water fish don't have swim bladders, like this golomyanka, which is a fish from Lake Baikal in Russia. And it's basically almost made of solid oil. It's called the candlefish. And when they occasionally wash up on shore, they just like melt. They're just all lipids. And it's because they live without having to regulate that buoyancy. They don't have an air bladder in that same way. So then there's a lot of organisms that deal with surface tension. So water molecules are attracted to each other because of hydrogen bonds, and we'll go into a little bit more detail in other videos. But water molecules are not attracted to the air, and so this creates this skin of water at the surface. And organisms can play on that skin, either on the top or on the bottom, or it becomes a barrier to movement. So some organisms can't pass through that surface tension, and so it becomes a real barrier for them. But organisms that are able to play with the ratio of the surface tension to the gravitational force. This is not my term, but Vogel in 1994 called this ratio the Jesus number, which allows some organisms to walk on the surface of the water. And here you can see a picture of a water strider, and scientists are trying to understand how they can propel themselves. So they use these really cool dyes that show vortices as they're moving along the surface of the water. Living in still water, some of the key factors are things like water pressure, water density, and buoyancy. Viscosity is less important in still water than in flowing waters. In still water, you can live on the surface, you can live in the water column, or you can live on the bottom, which is called the benthos. Insects that live very deep in lakes, they can do that because they're not very compressible. They have very dense tissues and their exoskeletons protect them. But water pressure as you move up can be more of a problem, especially for organisms that live below the surface as larvae. As they're metamorphosing into adults, they have to contend with this very intense change in pressure, moving up the water column and then out into the air. Negative buoyancy. Most insects are negatively buoyant, meaning that they don't have air, like swim bladders, and it means that they'll sink. And so they have to actually expend energy to keep moving actively. Most aquatic insects have negative buoyancy and have to expend energy. Some organisms can carry gas bubbles, and this will influence their buoyancy. So you can see in this picture a variety of spiders that carry different gas bubbles underwater. And all of these things that I just talked about are some of the main reasons that very few insects actually live in the water column. They live on the surface, they live on the benthos, and there's only a few that live in the water column. There are other organisms like zooplankton and phytoplankton that really spend a lot of their time in the water column, but they tend to be much smaller. So one of the organisms that really does live in the water column is called Chalboris, and it's a phantom midge, and they're really cool looking organisms. They're predatory fly larvae. They have these semi-rigid tracheal sacs at the front and at the back. There's kind of a close-up right here where it shows these kind of leopard print sacs. They're right here too on the front and in the back. And they're kind of like saddlebags. They can expand and contract the sacs using physical force, so they don't actually need new gas to come in and inflate them. They can actually like push them open and close them, so they can maintain their buoyancy really, really well. They're also, other than those kind of two bright spots, they're nearly transparent, and so they're very effective ambush predators. And on their sacs, they have these chromatophores that change color. So it gives them additional ability to hide from their prey. They can change the color of their sacs to match the color looking up or looking down in the water column. So a lot of really cool organisms live on the surface of quiet waters, things like lakes and ponds and wetlands. And some live in quiet side channels of streams and rivers, things like pools. But you don't find a lot of surface tension dwellers in very swiftly flowing rivers because there's too much turbulence, and the rapids and the riffles create and break up the surface tension of the water. So here we have hemipterans like Gerridae in the family Gerridae, um, Hydrometridae and Veliidae. So we have, these are water striders, these are water measurers, and these are little tiny water striders. We also have this one species of ocean-going water strider, Halobates, which is a marine insect that lives most of its life out in the open ocean. So lightweight animals can be supported by the surface tension of water, and it's because the surface film gets distorted, bent, and it curves down, and then that creates an upward force. There's this really cool image here from Hu et al. 2003 showing the angle and the curvature of the point of contact for the leg and this kind of force that pushes the organism back up. They actually built this robot to mimic a water strider. It's like 10 times larger than the strider, but it can support itself on the surface tension of the water too. They do think there is a maximum size. You don't see really, really large organisms, although there are some lizards and snakes and big spiders in the tropics that can quickly move across the surface of the water. But they also think there's a minimum size for water walking. So you have to be big enough that your legs don't just kind of punch right through the surface tension. A lot of these organisms have water repellent leg surfaces, waxy coatings, dense hairs called macrotrichia that help to repel the water and live on the surface. So hair density is important, and they also usually produce really tiny hairs in between larger ones, kind of similar to animals that produce hairs that are water repellent as well, like polar bears and beavers. The hairs can trap air, and then the tips of the legs curve upward so that they don't pierce the water surface. So they hit the water at this kind of bend, so they kind of lay on the surface of the water. Because if they poke down, they would puncture the surface tension, and that would be challenging. And then the final thing is that there are these nano grooves, really teeny tiny grooves down the hairs that help the organism trap even more air to get it up onto the surface. The only problem for water striders, other than things like rapids and turbulence, is rain. Rain tends to disturb the surface tension, and so they end up jumping, I guess, a lot in rainstorms to try to keep on top of the water. So I'm going to stop here. Those of you who have taken freshwater ecology already heard this part of the lecture on the properties of water, so you can jump ahead to one of the next parts.